Estoy aquí. No, aquí. Ajá. Ay, luz, por favor. That's better. Today, we're going to learn how to form the present tense, el presente, of many kinds of verbs. For regular verbs, the present tense is formed by dropping the AR, ER, and IR infinitive endings and adding personal endings. Make sense? Now, you use the present tense to talk about actions or situations that are going on now.
¿Por qué rompes conmigo?
And also to express something that is generally true.
Porque no te amo.
You also use the present tense to talk about actions that happen on a regular basis.
Mis padres me escriben con frecuencia.
Or actions that will take place in the near future.
Mañana les mando una carta larga.
Muy bien. Let's learn about some verbs that change their stem vowel in the present tense. These are called stem-changing verbs. Remember them? For these verbs, the vowel in the stem changes in the present tense. The E in pensar changes to IE. The O in poder changes to UE. And the E in pedir changes to I. Let's look at the present tense of these verbs more closely.
Pensar. Pienso. Piensas. Piensa. Pensamos. Pensáis. Piensan. Poder. Puedo. Puedes. Puede. Podemos. Podéis. Pueden. Pedir. Pido. Pides. Pide. Pedimos. Pedís. Piden.
Atención, the verb jugar also has a stem change in the present tense. The U changes to UE. Like other stem-changing verbs, the nosotros, nosotras, and vosotros, vosotras forms do not change. The verbs construir, destruir, incluir, and influir have a spelling change. Look here at incluir. You add Y before the personal endings, except the nosotros, nosotras, and vosotros, vosotras forms. Many ER and IR verbs are irregular in the yo form of the present tense. For example, verbs that end in CER or CIR change to ZCO in the yo form. Here are some other CER and CIR verbs that change to ZCO in the yo form.
Crecer. Yo crezco. Obedecer. Yo obedezco. Parecer. Yo parezco. Producir. Yo produzco. Traducir. Yo traduzco.
Verbs that end in GER or GIR change to JO in the yo form. Here are a couple of other GER and GIR verbs that change to JO in the yo form.
Exigir. Yo exijo. Proteger. Yo protejo.
And there's a handful of verbs that have irregular GO endings in the yo form, como estos.
Caer. Yo caigo. Distinguir. Yo distingo. Hacer. Yo hago. Poner. Yo pongo. Salir. Yo salgo. Traer. Yo traigo. Valer. Yo valgo.
And guess what? A few verbs have unique, irregular yo forms. Atención, some of these verbs have prefixes, but even so, they follow the same patterns in their yo forms. Watch closely. Atención, some verbs with irregular yo forms also have stem changes. Mira.
Conseguir. Consigo. Corregir. Corrijo. Elegir. Elijo. Seguir. Sigo. Torcer. Tuerzo.
Shall we move on? Now, there are many other common verbs in Spanish that are irregular in the present tense. Some are irregular only in the yo form.
Dar, doy, das, da, damos, dais, dan.
Some are irregular in the yo form and have a stem change in other forms, like this.
Decir, digo, dices, dice, decimos, decís, dicen. Estar, estoy, estás, está, estamos, estáis, están. Oír, oigo, oyes, oye, oímos, oís, oyen. Tener, tengo, tienes, tiene, tenemos, tenéis, tienen. Venir, vengo, vienes, viene, venimos, venís, vienen.
And finally, some verbs are irregular in all present tense forms.
Ir, voy, vas, va, vamos, vais, van. Ser, soy, eres, es, somos, sois, son.
Tremendo, clase. Ahora podemos hablar en el presente. ¡Oh, maestro Dalí! ¿Qué produce usted ahora? Hola a todos. Perdón, solo estoy terminando mi almuerzo. Ay, qué rico. Now I will have the energy to get through this lesson about ser and estar. Ser and estar are two verbs that can both be translated as to be in English. Even though both describe the state of being, they are not interchangeable. You use the verb ser to express the idea of being permanent. That is, the qualities and characteristics of a person, place, or thing that do not change. Use ser to describe a person's nationality and place of origin. Use ser to describe someone's profession or occupation. Use ser to describe the characteristics of people, animals, and things. Use ser to generalize, that is, to say what is generally true about something. Use ser to talk about possession or ownership. Use ser to describe the material of composition, that is, what something is made of. Use ser to express the time, the date, or the season of the year. And finally, use ser to say where or when an event takes place. Muy bien. Now, let's take a look at how the verb estar is different. You use the verb estar to express states of being that are temporary. This includes qualities or conditions that change with time. Use estar to describe location or spatial relationships, that is, where something is in relation to something else. Use estar to describe a person's health. Use estar to describe the physical states and conditions of objects. Use estar to describe people's emotional states. Use estar to say certain weather expressions. Use estar to talk about ongoing actions in progressive tenses. And lastly, use estar to express the results of actions with past participles. Now let's see the different ways that ser and estar describe states of being when used with adjectives. You use the verb ser with adjectives when you want to describe the inherent or expected qualities of something. Por ejemplo,
¿Cómo son tus padres?
in this example, the speaker wants to know what someone's parents are like as people. In other words, what are their inherent qualities? The listener is expected to respond with ser plus adjectives that describe the way his or her parents usually are. Here's another example.
La casa es muy pequeña.
Here, the adjective pequeña describes the size of the house. Because that size is not expected to change, the speaker uses es. On the other hand, you use estar with adjectives to describe the temporary or variable qualities of something, or to express a change in appearance or condition. Watch.
¿Cómo estás, Miguel?
In this example, the speaker wants to know how Miguel is feeling at this moment. He or she knows that Miguel's feelings are temporary and could change later. Miguel will be expected to respond with estar plus an adjective to say how he's feeling. Here's another example.
¿Están tan enojados?
Here, the adjective enojados describes how these persons are feeling right now. Angry. That feeling could change, so the speaker uses están. With most descriptive adjectives, you can use either ser or estar, but the meaning of the sentence changes depending on which verb you use. Let's look.
Julio es alto, but ¿qué alto está Miguelito? Dolores es alegre, but el jefe está alegre hoy. ¿Qué le pasa? Juan Carlos es un hombre guapo, but Manuel, estás muy guapo.
Atención, you use the verb estar, not ser, with the adjectives muerto and muerta, like this.
Becker, el autor de las rimas, está muerto.
Now, some adjectives have two different meanings, depending on whether you use them with ser or estar. For example,
La clase de contabilidad es aburrida, but estoy aburrida de la clase. Ese chico es listo, but estoy listo para todo. No soy rico, pero vivo bien, but el pan está tan rico. Las manzanas son buenas, but estas manzanas están buenas. Este coche es seguro, but Juan no está seguro de sí mismo. Los aguacates son verdes, but esta banana está verde. Javier es muy vivo, but ¿todavía está vivo el autor? Pedro es un hombre libre, but esta noche no estoy libre. Lo siento.
muy bien, estoy feliz de nuestro progreso. Did you see that? Es una llama. Me parece que está perdida. Mira, clase. ¿Qué estamos haciendo hoy? Sí, estamos jugando en la biblioteca. Estamos jugando en la biblioteca. Ella tiene razón. We shouldn't be playing. Today we are learning about progressive forms in Spanish. The progressive is a verb form that describes what is happening right now. In Spanish, the present progressive, or el presente progresivo, describes an action that is in progress. You form the present progressive with the present tense of estar and the present participle, or el gerundio, of the main verb. Take a look at these examples.
Juan está cantando. Eduardo está bebiendo café.
You form the present participle of regular verbs by dropping the AR, ER, and IR endings from infinitives and adding the endings ando and yendo. See?
Bailar. bailando. Comer, comiendo. Aplaudir, aplaudiendo.
Atención! When you use progressive forms with reflexive or object pronouns, you may either attach the pronouns to the participle or place them before the conjugated form of estar. A ver.
Se están enamorando. Están enamorándose. Te estoy hablando. Estoy hablándote.
Did you notice anything? When the pronoun is attached to the participle, you need to add an accent to the first vowel of the ending to keep the proper stress. Hablándote. Ah, almost forgot. Note that the present participle of ser is siendo. Bueno. Now let's look at a few verbs that have irregular present participles. IR verbs that have a stem change in the present tense also change their stem vowel when you form the present participle. Mira.
Decir, diciendo. Dormir, durmiendo. Mentir, mintiendo. Morir, muriendo. Pedir, pidiendo. Sentir, sintiendo. Sugerir, sugiriendo.
The verbs ir, poder, reír, and sonreír all have irregular present participles. Yendo, pudiendo, riendo, sonriendo. But I'll let you in on a little secret. You hardly ever use ir and poder in the present progressive.
Marisa siempre está sonriendo. Maribel no está yendo a clase últimamente.
Okay, now, for ER and IR verbs whose stems end in a vowel, the I of the participle ending changes to Y. Vamos a ver.
Construir. Construyendo. Leer. Leyendo. Oír. Oyendo. Traer. Trayendo.
Progressive forms are used more in English than Spanish. Generally, you only use the progressive in Spanish to emphasize that an action is in progress at the moment it's described. To talk about actions that take place over a period of time or in the near future, use the present tense instead. Let's look at the difference.
Lourdes estudia economía en la UNAM. Ahora mismo, Lourdes está tomando un examen.
Atención! Other tenses may also have progressive forms. They emphasize actions that were in progress in the past and will be in progress in the future.
Estaba marcando su número justo cuando él me llamó. No vengas a las 4. Todavía estaremos trabajando.
Now let's look at other ways you can use present participles in sentences. You have learned that the present progressive is formed with estar and a present participle. In Spanish, progressive action can also be expressed with other verbs. Verbs like seguir, continuar, ir, venir, llevar, and andar with a present participle give different meanings to actions in progress. Seguir and continuar with a present participle express the idea to keep doing something. Watch.
Emilio sigue saliendo con Mercedes. Mercedes continúa coqueteando con Carlos.
Ir with a present participle expresses a process that is gradual or repeated. In English, it's like saying more and more.
Cada día que pasa voy disfrutando más de esta clase. Ana y Juan van acostumbrándose al horario de clase.
Venir and llevar with a present participle express a gradual action that builds up or increases over time.
Hace años que viene diciendo cuánto le gusta el béisbol. Llevo insistiendo en lo mismo desde el principio.
And last but not least, andar with the present participle expresses the idea of going around doing something or always doing something. Take a look.
José siempre anda quejándose de todo. Román anda diciendo mentiras.
Now you can talk about things that are happening, well, right now. ¡Ay! ¿Qué está haciendo ese jaguar en la biblioteca? Bueno, yo me quedo aquí hasta que se vaya. As you know, pronouns are words that take the place of nouns. Pronouns that receive the action of a verb are called object pronouns. There are two kinds of object pronouns. Indirect object pronouns say to whom, to what, or for whom an action is performed. These are the indirect object pronouns.
Me, te, le, nos, os, les.
Now, direct object pronouns say who directly receives the action of the verb. These are the direct object pronouns.
Me, te, lo, la, nos, os, los, las.
Indirect and direct object pronouns come before the conjugated verb in a sentence.
Carla siempre me da entradas para el teatro. Ella las consigue gratis.
Atención, in Spanish, it is common to repeat the indirect object. Les regalé boletos a mis amigos. When the verb is in the infinitive form, you can attach the object pronouns to the infinitive, or you can put them before the conjugated verb.
Vamos a darle un regalo. Le vamos a dar un regalo.
When the verb is in the progressive form, you can attach the object pronouns to the present participle, or you can put them before the conjugated verb.
Pedro está cantándome una canción. Pedro me está cantando una canción.
Atención, you can use lo to refer to a thing or idea that has no gender.
¿Vas a aceptar la oferta? Lo voy a pensar.
Now let's see what happens when you have two of them in the same sentence. When an indirect object pronoun and a direct object pronoun are used together in a sentence, the indirect object pronoun comes first. Let's take a look.
Me mandaron los boletos por correo. Me los mandaron por correo.
Muy bien. Now let's look at a special rule when both direct and indirect object pronouns are in the third person. The indirect object pronouns le and les both change to se when they are used with the direct object pronouns lo, la, los, or las. Let's watch what happens.
Le enseña las invitaciones a Elena. Se las enseña.
Okay, one last point, and you'll get a chance to put this wonderful knowledge to use. Remember that when object pronouns attach to infinitives, present participles, or commands, a written accent is sometimes required to maintain the proper word stress, like this.
Cantármela. Escribiéndole. Acompáñeme.
Remember, prepositions are words that give more information about the subject or action of a sentence. Some common Spanish prepositions are a, de, en, por, and para. Prepositional pronouns are the objects of prepositions, which means they come after prepositions. These are the singular prepositional pronouns.
Mi, ti, usted, sí, él, ella, sí.
And here are the plural prepositional pronouns.
Nosotros, nosotras, vosotros, vosotras, ustedes, sí, ellos, ellas, sí.
To clarify or emphasize the person you are talking about, you can repeat the indirect object with a plus a prepositional pronoun, like this.
¿Te gusta aquel cantante? A mí me fascina. ¿A quién se lo dieron? Se lo dieron a ella.
Sometimes you need to clarify or emphasize the relationship between the subject and the object of a sentence. For example, look at this sentence. José se lo regaló. José gave a gift, but we don't know if he gave it to himself or to someone else. If he gave it to someone else, add a plus the prepositional pronoun, as you have learned. José se lo regaló a él. If José gave the gift to himself, add a plus the prepositional pronoun sí plus the adjective mismo. José se lo regaló a sí mismo. Cuidado, the adjective mismo has to agree in number and gender with the subject.
José se lo regaló a sí mismo. Carmen se lo regaló a sí misma. Mis hermanos se lo regalaron a sí mismos. Las chicas se lo regalaron a sí mismas.
When you want to use the preposition con with the pronouns mi, ti, and si, together they become the words conmigo, contigo, and consigo.
Laura siempre lleva su computadora portátil consigo.
Some prepositions are followed by yo and tú instead of mi and ti. These include entre, excepto, incluso, menos, salvo, and según. Por ejemplo,
Entre tú y yo, Juan me cae mal.
muy bien hecho, todos. Ya me prestan atención. Now you're paying attention to me. Y ahora no me están prestando atención. Well, if you can't beat them, join. No hay nada que ver. No me gusta esto, ni esto. Ah, justo lo que buscaba. Me fascina este canal. This is what I want to watch. As you have learned, gustar is translated as to like in English. However, its literal translation is to please. You may remember that gustar is usually preceded by an indirect object pronoun. Remember that indirect object pronouns describe to whom or for whom an action is performed. Let's review the indirect object pronouns, shall we?
Me, te, le, nos, os, les.
And in the case of gustar, the indirect object pronoun indicates the person who is pleased. Watch.
Me gusta la película. ¿Te gustan los conciertos de rock?
After the indirect object pronoun and a form of gustar, the thing or person that pleases usually follows. In fact, that's the subject of gustar. Let's take another look.
Me gusta la película. ¿Te gustan los conciertos de rock?
Now, since the thing or person that pleases is the subject, gustar agrees with it in person and number. Most of the time, the subject is in the third person singular or plural. Watch.
Nos gusta la música pop.
In this example, la música pop is singular, and it's the subject of the sentence. So gustar takes the third person singular form to agree with la música pop. Nos gusta la música pop. And here's another example.
Les gusta su casa nueva.
Now consider the following sentence.
Me gustan las quesadillas.
Here, las quesadillas is plural, and it's the subject of the sentence. So gustar takes the third person plural form to agree with las quesadillas. Atención, this is true even if the person to whom the quesadillas are pleasing is singular. Now, in this case, they're pleasing to me. Me gustan las quesadillas. And here's another example.
¿Te gustan las películas románticas?
When gustar is followed by one or more verbs in the infinitive, the third person singular form of gustar is always used, like this.
No nos gusta llegar tarde. Les gusta cantar y bailar.
Oh, I almost forgot to mention, to soften your tone when making a request, you can use gustar in the conditional, gustaría. But don't forget to include the indirect object pronoun there too.
Me gustaría un refresco con hielo, por favor. ¿Te gustaría salir a cenar esta noche conmigo?
Let's move on. Many other verbs, some of which you've already learned, follow the same pattern as gustar. Take a look.
Aburrir, caer mal, caer bien, disgustar, doler. Encantar, faltar, fascinar, hacer falta. Importar, interesar, molestar. Preocupar, quedar, sorprender.
Now check out the following examples.
Me fascina el álbum. ¿Te molesta si voy contigo? A Sandra le disgusta esa situación. Le duelen las rodillas.
If you want to emphasize or clarify who is pleased, bothered, etc., use the indirect object pronoun along with a before the noun or prepositional pronoun. Watch.
A ella no le gusta bailar, pero a él sí. A Felipe le molesta ir de compras.
Don't worry. In Spanish, it doesn't sound redundant to use both the indirect object pronoun and the noun or prepositional pronoun. It's perfectly okay. Faltar expresses what someone or something lacks, and quedar expresses what someone or something has left. Take a look.
Le falta dinero. Me faltan 2 pesos. A la impresora no le queda papel.
Quedar is also used to talk about how clothing fits or looks on someone. Observe.
Esa falda te queda bien.
Pocas cosas me interesan tanto como la gramática. Pero ahora estoy cansada. ¿Les molesta si duermo un poco? Gracias. Bienvenidos a todos. Are you ready? Because I have something very interesting to show you today. Oops. How did that get in there? Hold on. I want to tell you about reflexive verbs. With a reflexive verb, the subject performs and receives the action. Reflexive verbs, verbos reflexivos, always use reflexive pronouns. Me, te, se, nos, os, and se. Here's an example of the reflexive in a sentence.
Elena se lava la cara.
In this example, Elena washes her own face. Now, here is the same verb in a non-reflexive sentence.
Elena lava los platos.
Notice there is no reflexive pronoun here. Elena is washing something else, the dishes. Now let's look at all of the forms of the reflexive verb lavarse.
Yo me lavo. Tú te lavas. Usted se lava. Él se lava. Ella se lava. Nosotros nos lavamos. Nosotras nos lavamos. Vosotros os laváis. Vosotras os laváis. Ustedes se lavan. Ellos se lavan. Ellas se lavan.
A lot of the verbs we use to talk about daily routines and personal care are reflexive. Let's take a look.
Acostarse. Afeitarse. Bañarse. Cepillarse. Despertarse.
And here are a few more.
Dormirse. Ducharse. Lavarse. Levantarse. Maquillarse.
Phew, just a few more and that's it.
Peinarse. Ponerse. Quitarse. Secarse. Vestirse.
In Spanish, most verbs that can take direct objects can also be used as reflexive verbs. This shows that the subject is doing the action to or for himself or herself. Let's look at an example.
Félix divirtió a los invitados con sus chistes.
Now we'll use the same verb in the reflexive form. Watch.
Félix se divirtió en la fiesta.
Do you see the difference? Here's another example.
Ana acostó a los gemelos antes de las 9. Ana se acostó muy tarde.
A lot of verbs change meaning when they take a reflexive pronoun. Let's look at some of them.
Aburrir. Aburrirse. Acordar. Acordarse. Comer. Comerse. Dormir. Dormirse.
Here's another group.
Ir. Irse. Llevar. Llevarse. Mudar. Mudarse. Parecer. Parecerse.
And one last group.
Poner. Ponerse. Quitar. Quitarse.
Atención! Some Spanish verbs are used in the reflexive even though the same verbs in English would not be. Many of these are followed by the prepositions a, de, or en. Let's look at some examples.
Acercarse a. Arrepentirse de. Atreverse a. Convertirse en. Darse cuenta de. Enterarse de. Fijarse en. Morirse de. Olvidarse de. Preocuparse por. Quejarse de. Sorprenderse de.
Wow, son muchos verbos, ¿no? Now I want to tell you about some more ways to use reflexive verbs. You can express to get or to become with the reflexive verb ponerse plus an adjective. For example,
Pilar se pone muy nerviosa cuando habla en público. Si no duermo bien, me pongo insoportable.
The verbs hacerse and volverse can also mean to become.
Se ha hecho cantante. ¿Te has vuelto loco?
In the plural, reflexive verbs can show reciprocal actions that people do to each other. Let me show you what I mean.
Los dos equipos se saludan antes de comenzar el partido. Los entrenadores se están peleando otra vez.
When you use a reflexive pronoun and a direct object pronoun together in a sentence, put the reflexive pronoun first. Watch.
¿Te comiste el pastel? Sí, me lo comí.
Atención! If the verb is an infinitive or a present participle, the reflexive pronoun follows the same rules of placement as object pronouns do. And now it's time for... ¿Huh? Pero, ¿qué es esto? Esa mujer se parece mucho a Eva Perón. Doña Evita, lo siento, pero todavía no le toca a usted. A ver, necesito unas galletas, un pastel, muchos dulces. Ay, perdón. I was just working on my very healthy grocery list. Lo haré más tarde. Let's move on to our lesson. Today, we are going to focus on el pretérito, or the preterite tense. You use the preterite to describe actions or events that began or were completed at a specific moment in the past. First, let's look at how to form the preterite of regular AR, ER, and IR verbs. Drop the infinitive ending, that's the AR, ER, or IR, and add the corresponding preterite endings. Did you notice that the endings of regular ER and IR verbs are identical in the preterite tense? They are. For all regular verbs and some irregular verbs in the preterite, there is a written accent on the preterite endings for the yo and usted, él, ella forms. Watch.
Ayer empecé un nuevo trabajo.
Atención! In Spain, when people describe recent past events, it's more common to use the present perfect than the preterite. You'll learn more about the present perfect in a future lesson. Verbs that end in CAR, GAR, and ZAR have a spelling change in the yo form of the preterite, but all the other forms are regular.
Buscar. Yo busqué. Llegar. Yo llegué. Empezar. Yo empecé.
The verbs caer, creer, leer, and oír change I to Y in the third person singular and plural forms of the preterite. Take a look.
Cayó. Cayeron. Creyó. Creyeron. Leyó. Leyeron. Oyó. Oyeron.
Notice that in all other forms, the I must have an accent. Similarly, verbs whose infinitive form ends in UIR change I to Y in the third person singular and plural forms of the preterite, like this.
Construyó. Construyeron. Incluyó. Incluyeron.
Now let's look at some more irregularities of the preterite. Stem-changing IR verbs also have a stem change in the third-person singular and plural forms of the preterite. However, stem-changing AR and ER verbs do not change their stems in the preterite. Let's look at these stem-changing IR verbs more closely.
Pidió, pidieron. Durmió, durmieron.
Atención! Here are some other IR stem-changing verbs.
Conseguir, consentir, hervir, morir, preferir, repetir, seguir, sentir, servir.
Now, a handful of verbs have irregular preterite stems. Pay attention to how none of these verb forms takes a written accent on its preterite endings. Let's start by looking at several U stems.
Anduve, anduviste, anduvo, anduvimos, anduvisteis, anduvieron. Estuve, estuviste, estuvo, estuvimos, estuvisteis, estuvieron. Pude, pudiste, pudo, pudimos, pudisteis, pudieron. Puse, pusiste, puso, pusimos, pusisteis, pusieron. Supe, supiste, supo, supimos, supisteis, supieron. Tuve, tuviste, tuvo, tuvimos, tuvisteis, tuvieron.
Take a look at this example.
Estuvimos en el parque ayer.
Now let's look at several I stems. Here again, none of these verb forms takes a written accent on its preterite endings. Watch.
Hice, hiciste, hizo, hicimos, hicisteis, hicieron. Quise, quisiste, quiso, quisimos, quisisteis, quisieron. Vine, viniste, vino, vinimos, vinisteis, vinieron.
And finally, let's take a look at some J stems. Once again, none of these verb forms takes a written accent on its preterite endings.
Conduje, condujiste, condujo, condujimos, condujisteis, condujeron. Dije, dijiste, dijo, dijimos, dijisteis, dijeron. Traje, trajiste, trajo, trajimos, trajisteis, trajeron.
Did you notice that the stem of decir not only ends in J, but also has a stem vowel change from E to I? In the usted, él, ella form of hacer, hizo, notice that the C changes to Z to maintain the pronunciation. And finally, most verbs that end in CIR also have J stems in the preterite. Now, ojo, the verbs ser, ir, dar, and ver also have irregular preterite forms. But guess what? The preterite forms of ser and ir are identical. Watch.
Fui, fuiste, fue, fuimos, fuisteis, fueron. Di, diste, dio, dimos, disteis, dieron. Vi, viste, vio, vimos, visteis, vieron.
Ah, and I almost forgot. The preterite of I is hubo. Watch.
Hubo 2 conciertos el viernes.
¡Qué práctico! Ahora podemos hablar del pasado usando el pretérito. Simón Bolívar. Pero hace años que murió. La 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 la. to sing almost as much as I love to read and learn grammar. Speaking of grammar, let's learn about another past tense in Spanish, the imperfect. You have already learned how to use the preterite tense to talk about past actions that began or were completed at a definite time. The imperfect is another past tense in Spanish. You use the imperfect to talk about past events without focusing on their beginning, end, or completion. Take a look at these examples.
La organización buscaba voluntarios. Nicolás y sus hermanas tenían que comprar regalos.
Let's look at how to form the imperfect tense of regular verbs, shall we? Like the preterite, you form the imperfect tense of regular verbs by dropping their infinitive endings. In other words, AR, ER, and IR, and adding imperfect endings. Veamos.
Caminaba, caminabas, caminaba, caminábamos, caminabais, caminaban. Debía, debías, debía, debíamos, debíais, debían. Habría, habrías, habría, habríamos, habríais, habrían.
As you can see, regular AR verbs take the endings aba, abas, aba, abamos, abais, aban. And regular ER and IR verbs take the endings ia, ias, ia, íamos, iais, ian. Ah, and notice that the endings are identical in the yo and usted, él, ella forms. And here's some great news. There are only 3 irregular verbs in the imperfect: ir, ser, and ver.
Iba, ibas, iba, íbamos, ibais, iban. Era, eras, era, éramos, erais, eran. Veía, veías, veía, veíamos, veíais, veían.
Now, the imperfect tense tells the story of what was going on during a certain time in the past. It often tells what was happening in the background. Watch.
Cuando yo era joven, vivía en una ciudad muy grande. Todas las semanas, mis padres y yo íbamos al centro comercial.
The imperfect of I is había. Watch.
Había 3 cajeras en el supermercado. Solo había un mesero en el café.
Moving right along. Some words and expressions are often used with the imperfect because they suggest habitual or repeated actions in the past. These include de niño, de niña, todos los días, mientras, and siempre. Take a look.
De niño vivía en un barrio de Madrid. Todos los días iba a la casa de mi abuela. Siempre escuchaba música mientras corría en el parque.
Ahora conoces 2 maneras de expresar el pasado en español. Oh, ¿Miguel de Cervantes? ¿Usted buscaba un libro? Perhaps he is in Spanish, the preterite and the imperfect. But how do we know which one to use when? Although the preterite and imperfect both express past actions or states, they have different uses, and they are not usually interchangeable. Take a look.
¿Paseaste en bicicleta por el río este verano? Antes yo iba con mi hermano. Le pidió ayuda con la clase de historia.
Let's start with the uses of the preterite. There are three main reasons you would use the preterite to talk about past events. The first use of the preterite is to express actions or states that the speaker considers as completed, like this.
Compraste esos muebles hace un mes, ¿no? Mis amigas fueron al centro comercial ayer.
The second use of the preterite is to express the beginning or end of a past action.
La telenovela empezó a las 8. Esta mañana se nos acabó el café.
And the third use of the preterite is to narrate a series of past actions. Watch.
Me levanté, me vestí y fui a clase. Lavamos la ropa, pasamos la aspiradora y quitamos el polvo.
Okay, now let's look at the uses of the imperfect. Here are 4 reasons you would use the imperfect to talk about past events. The first is to describe an ongoing action in the past without saying when it began or ended, like this.
Se acostaba muy temprano. Juan siempre tenía pesadillas.
The second use of the imperfect is to express habitual past actions.
Pedro jugaba al fútbol los domingos por la mañana. Los jueves solían comprar verduras en el mercado.
The third use of the imperfect is to describe mental, physical, and emotional states or conditions. Take a look.
En aquel entonces José Miguel solo tenía 15 años. Estaba tan hambriento que me comí medio pollo yo solo.
And the fourth use of the imperfect is to tell time in the past.
Eran las 8:30 de la mañana. Era la 1 en punto.
Now we're going to see how the two tenses fit together when talking about the past. When you narrate in the past, the imperfect describes what was happening, while the preterite describes actions that interrupt the ongoing activity. Let's look at a story that uses both the preterite and the imperfect tenses together.
Cuando conocí a Julia, los dos teníamos 15 años. Ella tocaba muy bien el piano. Me dijo que quería ser pianista profesional. Yo me quedaba horas escuchándola. Un día, mientras tocaba un concierto de Bach, me enamoré. Bueno, eso pensaba entonces, pero en realidad nunca la quise. Yo amaba su música, eso sí, pero solo su música. Cuando me di cuenta no sabía cómo decírselo. Afortunadamente fue Julia la que me dijo que quería otro.
¡Qué romántico! But back to work. Atención! When narrating a story in the past, here are some useful expressions for sequencing the events.
Primero, al principio, antes de, después de, mientras. Entonces, luego, siempre, al final, la última vez.
Atención! The imperfect progressive can also be used to describe a past action that was in progress but was interrupted by an event. Therefore, both ella estaba tocando el piano and ella tocaba el piano are possible. Now, there are some verbs that change meaning depending on whether they're expressed in the preterite or the imperfect. For example,
Quise encender la aspiradora, pero no pude.
the verbs querer, poder, saber, and conocer have different meanings in the preterite. Furthermore, no querer and no poder also have their own unique meaning in the preterite. Take a look.
Quería acompañarte. Quise acompañarte. No quise acompañarte. Ana podía hacerlo. Ana pudo hacerlo. Ana no pudo hacerlo. Ernesto sabía la verdad. Por fin Ernesto supo la verdad. Yo ya conocía a Andrés. Yo conocí a Andrés en la fiesta.
Ya sabes hablar de cualquier cosa en el pasado. Socks? Well, at least now you can tell a friend what happened in class. Mientras mi profesora enseñaba, cayeron calcetines. Dale, dele. Ay, ¿por qué no funciona? A lo mejor no pagué la factura del cable. Ah, my favorite show. The subjunctive in noun clauses. The subjunctive is rarely used in English, but it is common in Spanish. It expresses will, influence, emotion, doubt, or denial. Contrasted with the indicative, which is used to express actions, states, or facts that a speaker considers certain. The subjunctive expresses the speaker's attitude towards events, as well as his or her uncertainty about actions or states. Now, you use the subjunctive form of a verb primarily in the subordinate clause, also called the dependent clause of a sentence. We'll look at how to use the subjunctive in sentences a little later. First, let's review how to form the subjunctive, shall we? The present subjunctive is formed by taking the yo form of the present indicative, dropping the o, and adding the corresponding endings. First, take a look at a regular AR verb. Now, take a look at a regular ER verb. Finally, take a look at a regular IR verb. Moving right along, verbs that are irregular in the yo form of the present indicative show the same irregularity in all forms of the present subjunctive, like this.
Conozca, diga, haga, oiga, ponga, siga, tenga, traiga, venga, vea.
Atención! Verbs that end in CAR, GAR, and ZAR undergo spelling changes in the present subjunctive. Watch.
Sacar, saque, jugar, juegue, almorzar, almuerce.
Verbs with stem changes in the present indicative show the same changes in the present subjunctive.
Piense, pienses, piense, piensen, juegue, juegues, juegue, jueguen, muestre, muestres, muestre, muestren. Entienda, entiendas, entienda, entiendan. Resuelva, resuelvas, resuelva, resuelvan.
Atención, notice that some stem-changing IR verbs also undergo an additional stem change in the nosotros, nosotras, and vosotros, vosotras forms of the subjunctive.
Pidamos, pidáis, sintamos, sintáis, durmamos, durmáis.
All right, now, the verbs dar, estar, ir, saber, and ser are irregular in the present subjunctive.
De, des, de, demos, deis, den, esté, estés, esté, estemos, estéis, estén, vaya, vayas, vaya, vayamos, vayáis, vayan. sepa, sepas, sepa, sepamos, sepáis, sepan, sea, seas, sea, seamos, seáis, sean.
Atención! The present subjunctive form of I is haya. Take a look.
No creo que haya una solución.
As I mentioned earlier, the subjunctive is primarily used in a subordinate, also called a dependent clause. A clause is a group of words that contains both a subject, that is either expressed or implied, and a conjugated verb. In a subordinate noun clause, una oración subordinada sustantiva, the subject, verb, and other words function together, just as a noun would. Watch.
Quiero una aspirina. Quiero que hagas unos cambios en estos diseños.
When the subject of the main or independent clause exerts influence or will on the subject of the subordinate clause, the verb in the subordinate clause takes the subjunctive. Look.
Yo quiero que tú vayas al médico.
Now, here's a list of verbs and expressions of will and influence that are often followed by the subjunctive in the subordinate clause. Take a look at the following examples.
Necesito que consigas estas pastillas en la farmacia. Insisto en que vayas a la sala de emergencias.
Atención! The verb pedir is used with the subjunctive to ask someone to do something. But the verb preguntar is used to ask questions and is not followed by the subjunctive. Watch again.
No te pido que lo hagas ahora. No te pregunto si lo haces ahora.
When you use a verb or expression of will and influence and there's no change in subject, use the infinitive, not the subjunctive, to express the verb that follows the verb or expression of will and influence. Like this.
Quiero ir a Bogotá en junio.
Did you notice anything? In such cases, the connector que is not needed. Now, if there is a change of subject, then you'll need the connector and the subjunctive in a subordinate clause, like this.
Prefiero que vayas en agosto.
Now, let's look at other ways the subjunctive is used. When the main clause expresses an emotion, hope, fear, joy, pity, surprise, and so on, the verb in the subordinate clause must be in the subjunctive, if its subject is different from the one in the main clause, that is. Por ejemplo,
Espero que te recuperes pronto. Es terrible que Ana tenga esa enfermedad.
ready to see a list of verbs and expressions of emotion that are often followed by the subjunctive? Allá vamos! Atención! The subjunctive is also used with expressions of emotion that begin with que. Take a look.
Qué pena que él no vaya.
Also, the expression ojalá, which means I hope or I wish, is always followed by the subjunctive. Note that the use of que with ojalá is optional.
Ojalá que no te enfermes.
If there is no change of subject after verbs and expressions of emotion, use the infinitive, not the subjunctive. Same as with verbs and expressions of will and influence. Watch.
Esperamos llegar temprano.
But
Me alegro de que lo hagan ahora.
when the main clause implies doubt, uncertainty, or denial, the verb in the subordinate clause must be in the subjunctive if its subject is different from the one in the main clause, that is. Así.
No creo que él nos quiera engañar. Dudan que el jarabe sea un buen remedio.
And now, here's a list of verbs and expressions of doubt and denial that are often followed by the subjunctive. Atención! The subjunctive is also used after quizá, quizás, and tal vez when they signal uncertainty. By the way, in case you're wondering, quizá and quizás are interchangeable.
Quizás vengan a la fiesta.
Let's relax now and see if there's anything good on television. Ooh, this is perfect. Only good shows on tonight.